What up, Wizards? It's Deb, SBMTG. We like it in Magic, and welcome to new Capenna spoilers, Part 1, Part 2, Commons and Uncommons that we've seen so far. In case you missed it, we did the Rares and Mythics previewed so far in the set in this video. I'll leave a link in the description. But this one, make no mistake, is not just a draft limited stuff video, right? I actually think that some of the absolute best cards, including perhaps the best card we've seen so far, is a lower rarity card. So this is, again, not just draft chaff stuff. There's a lot of really important and impactful cards in this video. We've got a lot to go over. So without any further shtick or spiel, let's get to it. Let's talk about some Magic cards. So let's clear through some cards that are fairly not good. Here's Join the Maestros first. It's 5 mana, 4 and a black for a sorcery with casualty 2. You create a 4/3 black ogre warrior creature token. So for 5 mana, you can put 8 power out, but it's really just like putting 6 power out because you have to sacrifice a guy. Again, you turn it into an upside and it's okay, but in constructed Magic, I think you can probably still be doing a lot more for 5 mana than that. Next is another Maestros card. This is Maestros Initiate, 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 3/1 human citizen. You can pay 4 and then a hybrid red or blue to exile Maestros Initiate from your graveyard and draw 2 cards and discard a card. So I'm tempted by this, right? I want to be like, ooh, Reanimator, right? If you mill this into your yard and then you pay the mana and you can draw a couple of cards and then discard a fat guy, reanimate him later. But nah, 5 mana is way too much, honestly, and 3 mana is too much for like the creature half of it, right? So I guess the best thing this does is you play it for the 3 mana, you trade with the creature in combat, and then later on you can effectively get a card, go up a card, sort of, by paying 5 mana. You can do it at instant speed from your yard too. Like, all of this is okay, but I don't want to be fooled by a card like this again. I said that in the last video about certain kinds of like green abilities, and as far as this, like, ooh, once I'm in your graveyard I do a cool thing, like, I don't want to be fooled by this either. I really don't, because 5 mana is an outrageous amount of mana to be asked to spend for something like this. So I think this is strictly a limited playable card, but it is limited playable. Another Maestros card here is Maestros Theater, but I just want to say I'm not putting the Maestros cards in order. I'm kind of putting this in order of how relevant I think the cards are in a way, and surprisingly there's just 3 Maestros cards in a row. Maestros Theater is a land, and when it enters the battlefield you sacrifice it. When you do, search your library for a basic island, swamp, or mountain card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle, and you gain a life. So it's technically better than an Evolving Wilds, let's say, because it gains you the life. I actually think this is really neat. In all but 4 and 5 color decks, these will be better than an Evolving Wilds. And especially in decks that want to gain life, these will be much, much, much better than your basic Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse or whatever. So I do like this, and I think that it's somewhat relevant, especially to like budget commander players or other, again, budget-minded people who are putting together, you know, certain mana bases. I think it's a really, really neat card. I don't think it's super relevant, but I do think it's cool. The next few cards are all cards like that, by the way. I don't think they're relevant, but I think they're cool. Like Rumor Gatherer, for instance. 3 mana, 1 and 2 white for a 2/1 elf wizard with Alliance. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. If this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, you draw a card instead. So rather than this ability only procs once a turn, we get the ability to proc the ability twice, and it gets stronger the second time we proc it. Now, 2 creatures coming into play over the course of 1 turn is not something that's going to happen every single turn. So I think this is just weaker than like a Welcoming Vampire, both in terms of the text box on it and the stats, and I guess all 3 in terms of the casting cost too. This is way too hard to cast in a set that wants you to play 3 different colors in a limited environment, right? So I got a bunch of issues with this card, but I still think it's kind of cool, but almost certainly not worth playing in a constructed deck. Up next, though, is Graveyard Shift. This is 5 mana, 4 and a black for a sorcery, but it has flash as long as there are 5 or more mana values among cards in your graveyard. And you turn target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. So just your basic reanimation spell, but this one can have flash. I'm really liking the way that a sort of blue-black X Reanimator deck is shaping up right now with like Port of Carfell, which is a land that you can reanimate a creature with at instant speed. And this, which can also be instant speed. It may seem like a lot to get a bunch of different mana costs in your graveyard, and normally That would be really, really hard. But later on in the game, in a kind of solar flare deck, you know, a kind of control-oriented reanimator deck that looks to land its threat very late from the yard, this looks much better and easier to actually cast the way you want it to. So I'm not actually putting this out of contention for like fringe standard playability. Just the exact right reanimator deck could want this. Up next, let's look at Fairy Vandal, sort of just past the middle of the list here. And this is a card that I don't think has seen a ton of standard play before, but I believe was in the mono blue tempo deck that was all the rage just a couple of years ago. And could be a thing again. You know, mono blue already has some tools in terms of tempo that I think it could leverage pretty well. And now that it has Fairy Vandal, it has another decent flash creature. And it probably only really needed like one more of those. And Fairy Vandal, again, not the best creature ever printed, but it's proven to be a decent creature in the past, and decent might be all that deck really needs to just get that little bit over the line that it needed. But anyway, in case you don't know what Fairy Vandal is, and I'm just jabbering on about nothing while you're cooking, you know, let's look at Fairy Vandal. This is 2 mana, 1 and a blue, for a 1/2 Fairy Rogue with flash and flying. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on Vandal. Of course, that means you have to prioritize drawing extra cards, but it's something mono blue tends to be able to do for relatively cheap. So there's also the fact that Fairy Vandal doesn't have to really grow beyond 2 or 3 power to do enough damage. So again, important tool for tempo decks here, and I wouldn't be surprised if Vandal saw just a little bit of play. Now, up next, we're starting to really get into the good stuff here. Here's Courier's Briefcase. This is 2 mana, 1 and a green for an artifact that is a treasure. That means that you can tap it, sacrifice it for a mana of any color. Now, when it ETBs, you get a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token. You can also pay Wooburg, just one of each color, tap it and sacrifice it to draw 3 cards, which is quite good. I like to look at this as a prosperous innkeeper that does not gain life, but is capable of drawing a buttload of cards if you have the proper mana to do so. And I'm not sure that's a good trade-off, but I could see 5-color decks playing this instead of, or more likely on top of, a prosperous innkeeper. And I think that is where a card like this really sees all of its value. You already see the occasional 5-color deck in Standard that either plays a bunch of different planeswalkers, or sometimes it plays the like 6 mana Wooburg Saga that exiles a thing when it comes into play and then eventually becomes like a 6/6 dragon on the other half. That card sees very sparing arena play, and there's a couple of decks built around that card right now that you come up against every now and again. I think Briefcase might be really good in that deck as 2 mana ramp that fixes your mana, obviously, but also the deck makes 5 colors, so you can draw those 3 cards really easily. It makes a blocker. It's worth noting that in Limited, in this set, this fixes your mana, which is something you're going to need to do in a 3-color deck, right? But it also creates a little 1/1 guy for easy casualty play, right? Like easy casualty 1 stuff. So there's a lot of cool stuff about this card in Limited too. But I think this card might have a home in Standard, especially after Prosperous Innkeeper rotates, but even before. Let's look at Mage's Attendant next. A lot of people excited about this card because it's got one of their favorite cards on it. I'm not too sure. Mage's Attendant is 3 mana, 2 and a white for a 3/2 cat rogue. And when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 blue wizard creature token with 1, sacrifice this creature, counter target non-creature spell, unless its controller pays 1. So you get Mana Tithe. But not only do you get Mana Tithe, you get 4 power and stats on 2 guys for 3 mana. That is a solid 3-drop. It really is. And we've already got a Standard full of solid 3-drop white creatures to where it's like really difficult to make the decision on what to play in your white aggro deck. But I think this goes pretty well with a card like, say, Elite Spellbinder in your 3-drop slot. Again, there's way more other choices you might want to make in your 3-drop slot. But this functions, to me, similarly to a card like Spellbinder. It creates more power than Spellbinder. It creates more bodies than Spellbinder. And it backs up your opponent in a way similar to Spellbinder. Spellbinder can back them up by 2 turns, this by 1. But again, you're putting out more aggression, more power, more bodies. Your opponent is kind of prioritized to get rid of the body that counters the spell, but that's the smaller body. They get rid of that, they still have to contend with the 3-power body. So, I don't know. There's a lot of cool things about this card, especially against control decks, where this will back them up a turn from casting the Sweeper, the Doomscar. They could just die from that. If you can blink this, or maybe if you play a copy of this on turn 3 into another copy of it on turn 4, right? Then you're backing up your opponent by a couple of turns and they die to that because they can't cast the Sweeper. Maybe a way to look at this is that this card effectively has Ward 1 because you can sacrifice the dude to keep a removal spell from hitting this. In a way, this card gives all of your stuff Ward 1. If you think about it, and that's pretty good, Again, blinking it works to great effect. All of these cards with Alliance in this set, this works really well with, things that want multiple creatures to come into play, because this puts multiple creatures into play. This is probably decent in the blue-white tempo deck that we're looking at. This has homes in Standard, and a lot of reasons why you might want to play it. I'm still a little bit reticent on it, just because I think there are better 3-drops to play. There's so many good white 3-drops that it's hard to tell where this fits in. It might be a sideboard-only card against control decks, but even then, it's going to do its job very well. And a card that allows you to cast Mana Tithe in Standard effectively is a really good-looking card. And I imagine if you stack this up with Elite Spellbinders and Malevolent Hermits and Redains and even Thalias and stuff, it's just going to be nearly impossible for your opponent to do anything. So in these sort of, mono-white or blue-white taxes decks that we've been looking at lately, again, this card could easily find a home. So there's a lot of places for this card to go. A lot of sort of, turn sequences and play patterns to envision when it comes to this card. A lot of ways it can hold your opponent up. Even if it doesn't hold your opponent up, it's putting an awful lot of bodies and power on the battlefield. There's just too much to like about this card for it to not be, definitely in the top 10 cards that we've seen so far in this set. I think this card probably will see a fair amount of Standard play before it's all said and done. We will move on to Unlucky Witness next, another card that I'm already falling in love with. I haven't really gotten a chance to play with it yet, but I can already tell I like this card. This is just 1 red mana for a 1/1 human citizen, but when it dies, you exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until your next end step, you may play one of those cards. So imagine deadly disputing this thing, you deadly dispute it at the end of your opponent's turn on turn 2. And then you get to look at the top 2 cards. You get to exile the top 2 cards, right, when you sacrifice this thing. Play those the next turn. And you get to draw 2 cards. And you get treasure to help you play all the stuff you're looking at. It just seems absurd to sacrifice this to a deadly dispute. But even, blocking with it in combat on turn 3, right? Just even that seems very good. The only reason that you don't want to play this card is opportunity cost, right? How many of these do I get to play in my deck before, they become a liability? I don't want to draw it on turn 7, even though I kind of wouldn't mind drawing this on turn 7. Compared to a lot of other 1-drops you have the option to play in Standard right now, I think this is better than most of them on turn 7. So I'm a big fan of this. There's plenty of ways to sacrifice it in Standard. Casualty is a thing. This is the perfect sacrifice it to casualty thing that we could have asked for, right? There's that. Goes really well in Aristocrats decks. Extremely well, in fact, because Aristocrats decks are often churning to find 1 or 2 specific cards. If they're not doing that, then they run out of cards in their hand on turn 5 because they just vomit a bunch of creatures onto the table and they need gas. And this does both of those things. It churns and finds important cards for the combo deck while also getting gas in later turns for the combo deck. So, Unlucky Witness is just, this is a sick, they have been making really good 1-drops for Aristocrats lately. And this is just the next in a long line, and I just love this card, if you can't tell. But next, let's look at an offer you can't refuse. Now, the first thing I'll say about this card is that as a content creator, I have noticed that there is some joker working at Wizards who now makes the jokes for us. You see, as content creators, we hear that a Mafia-themed set's coming out, and we're like, okay, Sleeping with the Fishes, Concrete Shoes, an offer you can't refuse. And, they do the jokes. When they name the cards. They take those jokes away from your favorite content creators by simply naming the cards these things. I have a whole checklist of Mafias jokes that I want to be able to use, and they've used 3 of them on names of cards already. And this is one of them, but what does the card do? There's a reason it's where it is in this video. An offer you can't refuse is a single blue mana for an instant. Counter target non-creature spell. Its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. Now, I am some kind of rube. I am a mark, and I cannot refuse this offer. What I want to do with this is, play like a 1 mana spell. On turn 2, at the end of my opponent's turn, I want to try to cast like a Consider or some other, super low impact 1 mana spell. Counter it with my own an offer you can't refuse. Make 2 treasure tokens. Right? At the end of my opponent's second turn. And then untap on turn 3, play a land, and have 5 mana. So again, I can compare this to a Deadly Dispute, right? Because if you sacrifice a Shambling Cast to a Deadly Dispute at the end of your opponent's second turn, you end up with 5 mana on your third turn if you drop a land. This is very similar to that, but it doesn't draw you a bunch of cards the way Deadly Dispute does. But this technically costs less mana than Deadly Dispute and can be done in mono blue. So I imagine in mono blue, the ability to untap on turn 3 with 5 mana is very good. Untap on turn 3 in mono blue and drop an Emerith or some other 5-drop seems very good. And in the meantime, it's got another mode where you can actually use it to do what it's intended to do, which is counter spells. Think of how many situations on Arena in the last 6 months where it's super late in the game. You both have 12 lands and 4 treasure tokens out or something like that. You're both in top deck mode, And if you had access to a card like this, all right, you would have used it. When your opponent draws the sweeper that ends the game, or just a big bomby spell that ends the game or whatever, then you would have gladly given them 2 treasure tokens for a hamburger next Tuesday. Right? You would have given them the 2 treasure tokens to counter the thing that ends the game, right? So I do think that there's plenty of times where you do not care that you're giving them treasure, so long as you don't die immediately. So there's a couple of different ways to use this card, and I like both ways. I think this could be potentially much more impactful than it looks at first glance. But believe it or not, we have made it down to the last couple of cards of this video here, and these are some of the strongest cards in the set so far. Make no mistake. Let's look first at a little chat. Let's have us a little chat, why don't we? Just 2 mana, 1 in a blue for an instant with casualty 1. Look at the top 2 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the other on the bottom of your library. So this might as well be a Deadly Dispute that doesn't make treasure, but does look at basically twice the amount of cards that a Deadly Dispute does, or at least it can, and that's probably worth it. There are plenty of decks that want to play Deadly Dispute so they can play Lolth on turn 3, and I think they're still going to want to do that. So while Dispute is in the format, I'm not sure how much play this card sees. However, there's going to be decks that function more like combo decks, or just decks that want to draw 1 or 2 powerful or key cards to their deck. And this lets you see more cards, which in those decks may be the more powerful effect. So even though I'm tempted to say this card doesn't see any play because Deadly Dispute exists, I will still say that there is a chance, because seeing more cards is incredibly powerful, right? This is kind of like a Behold the Multiverse, in a way, that you never have to foretell first, right? You always pay 2 mana, rather, for the ability to see a total of 4 cards and draw 2 of them. Now, you may have to sacrifice an Eye Twitch or a Shambling Gas, but something tells me that you will be more than happy to do that. Right? So it all comes down to whether or not the decks that have the best things that you'd want to sacrifice for Casualty 1, Eye Twitch and Shambling Gas, want to play this and Deadly Dispute. Because I don't think they want to play this over Deadly Dispute. But it's a conversation worth having, and I do think the card looks very powerful. But not as powerful as the last card that we'll look at. And I have teased a couple of times that I think the best card in the set so far is a lower rarity card. And this is the card that I've been talking about. Let's talk for a second about Make Disappear, a common, a pauper playable Common is what I clock to be the best card in the set so far, but I could be very, very wrong. I've been wrong a lot. If you don't think this card looks powerful, I think you're wrong. I do, but again, I've been wrong before, but I've been kind of quietly freaking out about this card for a couple of days because I actually think this card could have so many effects on Standard, but Make Disappear. What's it actually do? It's 2 mana, 1 and a blue for an instant. With Casualty 1. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. So it's a miscalculation, but instead of cycling, you can supercharge it by sacrificing a 1 power guy. Casualty 1 is the best. Because again, decks with Eye Twitch, Shambling Ghast, and all kinds of other stuff, you know? Like there's that 1 mana red guy, Unlucky Witness, that we looked at earlier. Imagine how good he is. Sacrifice to this, you know? I know this card does not look incredibly good in the late game. But in the early game, turns 2 through 5, say, this card is going to shine even when not paid for the casualty cost, you know? Like, this isn't counter-target non-creature spell, counter-target creature spell, counter-target planeswalker, artifact, blah, blah, just counter-target spell. And it's not mana leak or anything, but it's still a really powerful effect that we have not had in Standard in a good long time now, and for a reason. This card is going to make you question your turn 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 play every single time because they might have this card. We already question that they might have Drawry Disruption or something. And now they get to play some number of Drawry Disruption and some number of this if they're playing creatures in their deck. Maybe even if they're not playing creatures in their deck. But very likely, this is going to be the Eye Twitch Shambling Ghast special, right? Let's say you're trying to cast a 4-mana card on turn 7. You know, we're late in the game at this point. Well, your opponent sacrifices their Shambling Ghast. They make you pay 4 for your Asika's Chariot, like an additional 4 for your Asika's Chariot. You can't do that. So they counter your spell, and they get value off of the Ghast. You've been bodied. You probably lose the game in that case. I think that all the way up to the pretty late turns of the game, this card is going to be relevant. And even without a creature on the table, this card is probably relevant all the way up to turn like 7. People drop Lolths on turn 5 with 5 mana all the time in this format. So the ability to just make them think twice with a Drawry Disruption has mattered tons and tons over the last year in Standard, right? So I think this card is going to matter even more in a lot of ways. Just a fantastic looking card to me that can counter any spell in the early and mid game, and that's really important. So again, I don't want to gush about it too much. I already have. I don't want to talk about it too much. I already have. I just think there's no bones about it. In my subjective opinion, this is probably the best and in a lot of ways one of the most concerning cards that we've seen in this entire set so far. If you don't fear this card starting on turn 2, you're probably not playing Magic in Standard correctly starting like 3 weeks from now. But that is it. We made it, everybody. We made it through the rares and the mythics and the commons and the uncommons, and we're all the way caught up at this point. And even if I have to keep using the wireless hotspot that we're using right now on Brittany's phone to upload these videos, I'm going to do what I have to do until Cox Cable decides to give me my internet back. I don't know what. We've had power since the storms. We've had power for like 5 days. I don't know why they won't give us the internet back and why they're being so weird about it. No, but in any case, if I start talking about that, I'll talk about it for another 10 minutes and you don't even care. So let's just keep it to stick to Magic, bud. Thanks. If you made it through like both of these videos, thank you so much. You're quite dedicated. I don't deserve that. But one way or the other, I will, for the last time, maybe. Probably not. Apologize for the delays this spoiler season. I know that a lot of you wait for the spoiler content. Some of you tell me that you don't even watch other people's content for spoiler season, which is nuts to me. Go watch Seth. Go watch Goldfish if you can't watch me or whatever. But I do appreciate the sentiment. I really do. I'm glad I could finally get these videos out for you guys. I really am. And so far, this set looks pretty hype. There's some really cool looking stuff in here that I can't wait to get down and play with. So let me know what your favorite stuff from the set so far is. Down there in the comments section. Anything I missed in terms of like combos or interactions or anything like that. If there's a couple of cards we haven't talked about yet, don't worry. We will talk about them soon. I know what those cards are. But aside from that, I'm done. Thanks for watching like 12 hours of my spoiler content. It's probably not that much. It's probably like an hour and a half of spoiler content over the last day. I really appreciate it. But we're back on. I'm alive. That's the important part. I know some of you thought the worst when I didn't show up for like 5 days. But I'm here. I'm here. I'm alive. I'm feeling good. I'm strong like bull. I'm doing good. So, one more time, I love you guys. And I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Blaze. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.